The world calls him a legend of British metal, but that steel-forged voice was not born under dazzling lights. It began on the wind-soaked fields of Yorkshire, where a boy stood motionless in a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow his breath. In that blackness, the wind lashed against the rocky edges like a warning. To go far, one must first learn how to survive the darkest regions within oneself. Biff Byford grew up amid the smell of coal dust, rooftops coated in cold ash, and winters harsh enough to test the endurance of any heart. When he later stood on stage, people said he was born to sing. But it was Yorkshire that tempered his voice into metal, heavy, deep, carrying the resonance of a life that did not come easily. He became the roar of Saxon, the soul of the new wave of British heavy metal, the symbol that led tens of thousands to raise their fists toward the night sky. Yet beneath that layer of legend was a man who nearly lost his life at 18, who wrestled with illness, who watched loved ones depart like passing stations on a journey that could not be stopped. Biff Byford's path is not only the history of Saxon, it is the history of a man who has had to rise again and again from the ashes. If one listens closely behind that roar, there still lingers the echo of a young voice once raised against the Yorkshire wind. Thin yet resilient, as if trying to hold on to something life is always too ready to take away. Biff Byford's childhood began in Skelmanthorpe, a place where the Yorkshire wind did not blow by season, but by its own temperament, cold enough that children learned to curl inward early, and silent enough at times that one could hear coal cracking beneath their feet. The house where he grew up was small, old, and always felt as though it were struggling to preserve the little warmth it had left. Biff was the youngest child in a family marked by more fractures than its exterior revealed. One biological brother, a half-sister from his father who was 20 years older, and a half-brother from his mother. Strange branches of a family tree a child could not fully understand, yet could feel in the unspoken tension of every meal, every half-closed door that seemed to guard something unsaid. The world of young Biff was held together by his mother, Irene, a woman neither tall nor imposing, yet possessing a calm that children recognize instinctively. A gentleness strong enough to stand against the harshness of that land. She was the only light in a house frequently flooded by cold shadows. Then that light went out when Biff was just 11. His mother died, leaving behind a void that made the entire house feel heavy, like the air before a storm. For a child not yet tall enough to reach the kitchen doorframe, that loss had no name, only the sensation that the world had suddenly grown frighteningly vast. His father, a war veteran returned from conflict, already carried darkness within him. Darkness sharpened rather than softened by alcohol. He drank to forget, and in doing so forgot the people who needed him most. On those nights, Biff learned that silence was sometimes the only way to keep a house from collapsing. But silence could not stop fate. When Biff was 13, his father's arm was caught in a textile machine, and from that day on, he was no longer the one who could support the family. A man who had survived war was brought down by the very place he earned his living. That accident left a mark so deep that Biff would never again see machines as lifeless objects. They could save or destroy a person in a single turn. His adolescence passed in poverty, but poverty was not the only lesson he learned. He went to work early while friends still ran over hills or played football after school. Biff helped out in factories, then trained as a baker. Each morning he woke with the smell of flour clinging to his sleeves. Each night he returned with machine oil embedded in his skin. The repetition of that life might have been enough to suffocate any dream. But for Biff, it instilled a different habit, the ability to stand firm by whatever means necessary. There were long nights when he sat alone in a corner of the workshop, the loom silent, yet the noise of the day still echoing in his head. There, for the first time, he allowed himself to hum a small melody, not for anyone else to hear, but to keep himself from sinking too deeply into silence. No one knew that in those cramped spaces, music was taking shape. Music born not of joy, but of the need to survive. Then life delivered the greatest test of his youth. At 17, on a desolate road cutting through the familiar Yorkshire fields, his motorcycle slid off the pavement and threw him into the freezing darkness of the earth. His leg was shattered, and the doctors did not hide their doubts. Biff lay there amid the steady rhythm of hospital machines, facing for the first time the possibility that the rest of his life might be confined to immobility. Those days moved so slowly that time itself seemed to be testing his endurance hour by hour. Yet in that white room, so stark it almost invited surrender, he understood something clearly. Life would not choose for him. He would have to choose it himself. The accident could have consigned him to the margins. But when he was discharged, what he felt was not fear, but a sharp, lucid awareness. Having escaped death, he could not return to his old rhythm of living. There are moments that push a person into a new chapter without warning. For Biff, music became that new chapter, not a carefully drawn dream, but an instinct born of having stared too closely into darkness, the kind of thing one only values when it nearly disappears. He continued doing manual labor to survive, but his mind no longer belonged to long shifts and the lifeless repetition of machinery. Small melodies, at first just a way to keep fatigue from taking over, gradually became something he reached for even as he walked the streets. They drew him back to an old guitar, loosely taught to him by a friend's older brother. Back then, music had been a pastime. After the accident, it became the first place where he truly found himself. From there, he entered a succession of small bands around Barnsley. Damp-walled rehearsal rooms, gigs played to only a handful of quiet onlookers, battered buzzing amplifiers. These were the places where he turned sweat into skill. It was there that he moved from playing bass and singing backing vocals to becoming a frontman, not because anyone handed him the role, but because his voice found its own way out. Thick, raw, sometimes rasping, as if to overpower the remnants of darkness still lodged in memory. In 1971, he appeared on an album for the first time with the psychedelic group Jumble Lane. He played flute and wrote several songs. The album made little impact, but it offered him his first clear mirror. Whether through an instrument or through his voice, his sound carried the same substance. Metal tempered by lived experience, impossible to fake, impossible to learn. After Jumble Lane, he joined the Iron Mad Wilkinson Band. Nights of playing stretched into exhaustion, journeys home cut through by cold, seeping into his clothes, days sustained on meager pay. Yet none of it made him doubt his path. Someone who had stood back up after a leg, once thought beyond saving, does not retreat from the smaller hardships of life behind a microphone. In 1973, he met Paul Quinn, a quiet guitarist, eyes always seeming to listen for a tone only he could hear. When they formed a new power trio together, Coast with drummer Al Dodd, everything clicked in a way no one could quite explain. Three people, three kinds of energy, colliding and throwing off music as raw as unpolished metal, yet pulsing with the urgency of those determined to prove they could still stand. Biff sang and played bass. Paul launched riffs that sounded light but cut sharp as a winter gust, and Al attacked the drums with the ferocity of someone who did not believe in tomorrow. Coast never became famous. But it did something no previous band had given him, the feeling that he was exactly where he belonged. In the mix of cigarette smoke and machine oil, under neon lights casting long shadows, Biff knew he was no longer seeing how it goes. After the accident at 17, having survived with a leg thin as thread, Coast was the first time he truly walked again, carrying the full weight of his life. Coast dissolved quietly. No arguments, no tears. Just a small band reaching the natural end of its cycle. Yet the silence after the final rehearsal was enough for Biff to realize he had changed. Some bands end like a full stop. Others end like a comma. Coast belonged to the latter, opening rather than closing, pushing him toward a road he could not yet see, but could feel with absolute clarity. In an old pub in Barnsley, where the clink of glasses blended with the damp smell of wood, Biff ran into Paul Quinn again. Few words were needed. A cigarette passed between hands, a few unfinished riffs, a shared glance. Not long after, they carried their instruments into a rehearsal room so small the ceiling seemed deliberately low, as if pressing the sound downward to test how much it could endure. Biff plugged into the amp. Paul struck a few opening notes, and the air in the room shifted. Not loud, not showy, but heavy, clear, carrying the weight of a sound that was no longer an experiment. The sound Biff and Paul discovered in that low-ceilinged room did not remain an idea. It became a force that drew others toward them. Graham Oliver, Steve Dawson, Pete Gill. None of them were wealthy. None had passed through the doors of a conservatory. Each carried the scent of manual labor, machine oil, hot steel, Yorkshire soil. But when they stood together in the same room, what emerged was stronger than all their circumstances combined, as if the cracks in each life had finally found a place to resonate. People asked what genre they were playing. They didn't answer, not for lack of definition, but because what they heard in themselves went beyond any existing label, a hard, direct form of metal, unpolished, a sound that knew exactly where it came from and where it intended to go. They played until the final note faded into a silence long as a held breath. And in that moment, a name surfaced, short, blunt, shaped like people who knew their own roots. No one argued. No one adjusted it. The name clung to the air as if it had chosen them long before they chose it. After that silent nod, they began touring with empty pockets, sleeping under stages, eating the cheapest food they could find at roadside cafes. There were nights when Biff drove an old car to the very limit of its endurance, cutting through darkness that seemed endless. Inside were instruments, stage clothes, and the fragile hope that somewhere a few people might be waiting to hear them play. Sometimes it was just four drunks in a pub. Sometimes a cold room with a sparse audience. But never once did they put the microphones down halfway through. Biff sang with an instinct reforged in the years he spent gathering himself back together after the accident. If there was breath left, there was sound. In 1979, their first album, Saxon, was released. Not an immediate explosion, but the first real footprint they left on the metallic ground of the NWO-BHM movement, then surging alongside Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, Motorhead. In those still raw recordings, Biff's voice sounded less like a singer's than a storyteller's, someone who had lived what he was singing. That directness set Saxon apart. They did not build a fictional universe to escape life. They took life itself and forged it into music. The early years of the 1980s opened in a blaze so bright that even they could hardly believe they were living inside it. Castle Donington, 1980. 70,000 people, a gray sky, wind cutting through Biff's voice like a steel blade fresh from the forge. From small clubs to major festivals, Saxon surged forward faster than anyone had predicted. Wheels of Steel, Strong Arm of the Law, Denim and Leather. 3 albums in 2 years turned them into a spearhead of the new wave of British heavy metal. Yet even at that moment, when everything seemed invincible, a quiet tremor had already begun beneath their feet. The label wanted more. They wanted Saxon to be more American, sleeker, more radio-friendly. They wanted the rough edges trimmed away, the very edges Biff considered the band's soul. But at that point, Saxon did not yet have the power to say no. Success turned every decision into pressure. Keep the old fans, attract new ones, compete with rivals growing at a ferocious pace. Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, Motorhead, each rose on a clearly defined identity, while Saxon were pulled into a game that was never truly theirs. Softer albums followed. Not bad, but not Saxon. They carried no Yorkshire earth, none of the cold cuts of northern wind. They confused the fans and confused the band even more. Saxon drifted into a gray zone, not commercial enough to conquer America, not raw enough to hold their ground in Britain. And that is the most dangerous place for any band to be. Not hated, but not truly chosen either. Inside the group, small cracks began to appear. No explosive arguments, no smashed instruments of rock cliché. Just exhaustion stretched too long, rehearsals heavy as mist, glances slowly losing their spark. Biff tried to hold everything upright, but the pressure itself drained him. From a man who sang by instinct, if there's breath left, there's sound, he became someone who had to sing to keep a listing ship afloat. At the same time, his private life began to collapse piece by piece. His father died. Other losses followed. Biff had survived a shattered leg that nearly severed his future, but adult grief came with no cast to hold it together. He still stood on stage, still shouted, still drove through the night to the next show, but those close to him could see it clearly. A darkness was walking beside him now, one that guitars could not fully drown out. Some members left. Others stayed, but were no longer the fierce versions of themselves from the early years. There were no dramatic announcements, only a widening distance between people who had once lived like brothers. Success had pulled them together. Difficulty, even in small doses, drove them apart faster than any tour ever could. Yet in those struggling years, something else quietly rose. Biff began writing deeper lyrics, no longer just stories of speed, engines, nights of fire. His words widened, taking on an epic lived-in quality, as if his fatigue were translating itself into language. Songs from this period did not always become hits, but they laid the foundation for a second Saxon. Heavier, deeper, less willing to bend to the market. The label kept pushing for change, kept wanting Saxon packaged, sellable, easily recognizable to American audiences. But the more he was pressed into a mold, the more Biff understood that preserving identity was not stubbornness. It was the only way a band could outlive a trend. Every time he signed off on another label demand, it felt like cutting away a small piece of himself. By the late 1980s, he knew they could not keep moving along that trajectory. Saxon were no longer on the summit, but neither had they fallen into the abyss. They stopped somewhere in between, a place without noise, without praise, yet more real than any stage light. That in-between space was painful, but necessary. It taught them to look back, to distinguish applause from essence. It forced them to choose a new direction, not built on anyone else's expectations. By the end of the decade, the shows went on, but the stage lights had changed their tone. No longer blinding, they softened, like the glow left after a great fire has drawn its breath away. Biff stood in it, singing a fraction slower, as if listening more carefully to himself in the widening silence around the band. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt the turn. The drives grew longer, The venues grew smaller, and music once fueled by noise now demanded something more. It demanded truth. Sometimes, stepping off stage as the back door closed, Biff would stand still for a few seconds, listening to the lighting rig powering down. That small sound reminded him of something familiar. Some chapters of life do not need to be brilliant, only quiet enough for a person to recover their true breathing. The 1990s arrived in precisely that quiet rhythm. Not a sharp turn, not a collision, but a hush that forced him to listen more closely to himself. As halls shrank and lights no longer shone straight into his face, he realized the voice once forged in Yorkshire wind had changed color. Not weaker, but thicker, lower, carrying the weight of years that could not be fully told in words. Music was no longer the roar of youth. It became a dialogue between him and what life had etched into him. A dialogue that needed no audience, yet resonated with the full weight of existence. And in those silences, Biff began rewriting his own life. Not a memoir in the usual sense, but a gathering of fragments he had once thought were only background noise to youth. Losing his mother, the accident at 17, long years of poverty, the light and shadow of Saxon. As he wrote, he realized each event belonged exactly where it stood, like riffs that cannot be swapped in a song already formed. Those pages were not meant to build another layer of legend, but to face the truth. Life only gains meaning when one understands how one has passed through it. It was the first time Biff was not singing, not standing before a crowd, but speaking to himself in the quietest voice he had ever used. From that moment on, everything that followed, loss and renewal alike, found clearer footing, as if his life had finally discovered a map to trace. His father's death during this period became a deep point of retreat in his mind. The man once broken by a textile machine left the world without warning, leaving a void that taught Biff how weighty things become only once they are gone. He carried that silence into his lyrics, and the songs began to move away from speed, engines, and blazing nights toward something larger: history, war, Anglo-Saxon identity, and the fragility in human beings that heavy metal rarely names. Writing music was no longer a task. It became the place where he kept his own breath alive. Solid Ball of Rock, Unleash the Beast, Metalhead. These albums were not made to please a shifting market, but to document a band reclaiming its core. In them, Biff's voice sounded as if he were translating his life into metal, concise, direct, weighted by experience rather than display. Between tours, his body began to send signals. One winter night in the studio, he placed a hand on his chest and felt the rhythm slip slightly. Not painful, but enough to make him stop. It was the first warning of the heart attack that would come later. He told no one. A man who had survived the accident at 17 understood well that fragility does not always arrive with an explosion. Sometimes it is just a subtle misbeat that no one else hears. The heart attack came years later, tearing through touring schedules and forcing him to sit still longer before stepping back on stage. Backstage, there were nights he had to close his eyes for a few seconds to see whether his body would hold. But when the door opened, he still walked out, like someone who knew each performance might be a gift rather than a given. From then on, his voice changed again, no longer power driven by hot blood, but the will to continue when the body no longer yielded easily. Ironically, it was in this seemingly weakest period that Biff wrote with the greatest strength. Killing Ground, Lionheart, and epic recordings about wars, kings, ancient histories, all flowed from a man learning to understand himself through his people's past. If Saxon's youth was a roar aimed at the future, this era felt like a return, downward, deeper, digging for the true metal beneath the noise. Once, on a European tour after a show in a small riverside city, an older fan handed him a photo of Saxon from 1981. Biff looked at his younger face, a man standing as if the world held nothing strong enough to break him. He felt no regret for that image, only a strange tenderness, as though looking at a former self who once believed he was immortal. Night wind brushed past as he stepped outside, carrying something familiar, like the Yorkshire wind from far away, still lodged in his lungs. In the closing years of the 2000s, as his hair turned gray and the stage no longer burned as brightly as before, Biff stood there with a calm that youth could never possess. His grip on the microphone was tighter, his steps slower, yet his gaze sharper than ever. He was no longer the man struggling to keep a band from tipping over. He was someone who had finally understood that true strength does not lie in the loudest scream, but in the ability to stand still amid the very things that once tried to crush you. He thought he had already passed through the greatest trials of his life, but life rarely ends at the chapters we believe we have fully understood. He believed his hardest trials were already behind him, left in the Yorkshire winters, in low-ceilinged rehearsal rooms, in the smoke-filled and pressure-heavy 1980s, in the nights of the 1990s when he sang simply to keep his soul from sinking to the bottom. But life rarely stops where we think we've grasped it. And when 2019 arrived, Biff realized that darkness does not always return with an explosion, but sometimes with a barely perceptible misbeat of the heart itself. The later years of an artist's life often arrive quietly, but for Biff Byford, silence was only background noise before another storm. 2019 did not open with a new riff or a sold-out tour, but with the cold metallic scent of an operating room. His heart was out of rhythm, no longer following the stubborn path it had kept through half a century of rock singing. The surgery went smoothly, but before his body could regain its balance, the doctor added a sentence that compressed the air in the room like a coffin lid, lowering halfway shut. There are signs of cancer. He heard those words the way one hears a low note dropping into a harmony played all one's life. No panic, no flight, just a stretch of silence long enough for those nearby to feel time hesitate. Then he took a breath, as if preparing to walk onto a stage. A man who had escaped death at 17 understood this well. Some chapters of life are written only when you face directly what you most want to avoid. He began treatment quietly, his body tired, his voice lowered, his breath shortened. But no one in the band ever heard him complain. On stage, he still stepped out like an old soldier who refuses to drop the flag. At home, he quietly checked hospital schedules the way one checks a show's set list. Once, his daughter asked if he was afraid. He smiled faintly and said, "I've already lived more than my childhood ever promised." Between 2020 and 2023, Saxon still released albums, still toured, still appeared before thousands, as if no surgery had ever taken place. But those close to him could see it clearly. His steps backstage were slower, his breathing before each song longer. When the lights went down and the crowd noise faded, he sat for an extra moment, hand resting on his knee, as if checking whether his body could still carry him where he wanted to go. Then 2024 arrived like a thin blade. Shows were postponed. Festivals were canceled. Messages sent to promoters carried a tone he had never written before. Unable to perform at this time. The hardest part was not losing the Nights of Fire, but the feeling that his body was betraying someone who had treated it as a loyal instrument for 50 years. The breaking point came in the summer of 2025 after a tour in Japan. After the final show, he walked into the dressing room, pulled off his shirt, and felt a fatigue sink deeper. than usual. The next morning, August 15th, 2025, he posted a statement that left the metal community silent. The cancer was not gone. He would need mopping up chemotherapy. No evasion, no concealment, no painting hope in bright colors. He told the truth in a voice as straight as a blade. The doctors say the prognosis is good. I will continue. I will keep the UK and Ireland tour in November. Those words spread fast, like the Saxon roar of years past. People called it a warrior's spirit. But to him, it was simply the habit of standing up again after the dark places life kept throwing at his feet. A man who once sang with a metal voice was now singing with the voice of someone who knew he was finite and still wanted to use every remaining day to make sound. During treatment, his voice grew deeper, not weaker, but different. A strength of another kind, the voice of an old wolf that has gone too far to turn back. Recording a few demo tracks in a small room in Yorkshire, he sang each line as if placing the final stone onto a wall he had spent his life building. No chasing high notes, no need to prove endurance. Only a true tone, thick, patient, and asking no permission from time. Some evenings, as dusk settled over the fields where he was born, he stood on the porch listening to the wind scrape through the rose bushes he had planted with his own hands. Paul Quinn called to ask how he was feeling. Biff replied with a line that sounded like a joke and wasn't. "If I can still sing tomorrow, it means I'm still here." Away from the stage, his life narrowed. Family, 2 old motorcycles, a small garden, a few cups of hot tea in a kitchen overlooking a windless Yorkshire. Outsiders called it slowing down. To him, it was the first time things were quiet enough to hear himself continue living. He still practices his voice every day, not to prepare for an album, but like someone keeping a fire through a long night, afraid that if he stops too long, the light might go out. The man who once sang before 70,000 people at Castle Donington now sometimes sings alone in a room. But the note still carries the weight of a lifetime that refused to bow. If music was the fire that pushed Biff forward for half a century, then his private life was the layer of hot embers smoldering behind it. The thing no one saw, but that was always there, sometimes as light as a passing breath of wind. Sometimes so heavy it could make him stop in the middle of the journey. From the earliest days, when Saxon still slept under stages and survived on scattered gigs, Biff understood a truth no one teaches. An artist can belong to tens of thousands, but the heart belongs to very few. And the more famous you become, the more fragile that boundary grows, like a metal wire pulled taut. Biff always kept his private life guarded, almost the complete opposite of the image of many rockers of his era drowning in scandal, noise, and wreckage. He did not chase the rebellious lifestyle of the 1980s, not out of morality or affectation, but because he knew exactly what he was built from. A childhood full of fractures, cold Yorkshire rooms, a mother lost too early, and a father who remained only in memories that stung. With a foundation like that, love was never a weapon for attention. It was a shelter, the place where the man holding a microphone before 70,000 people could set everything down and be nothing but himself. His first marriage arrived in the period when Saxon were shining at their brightest. When the lights are too blinding, it is hard to see the long shadows behind them. Endless tours, nights of shows stitched together like an infinite loop, the roar of truck engines, the smell of machine oil, the crowd, riffs like blades. It all fused into another kind of life that sometimes left Biff no longer belonging to the ground. He tried to keep the marriage inside a pocket of calm, but the distance between stage and home was too wide for one person to stand forever on both sides. Returns that ran late beyond the promised hour, mornings waking in strange hotels that made him forget what day it was. important occasions missed, as if they had drifted by in a part of life that no longer belonged to him. That marriage did not break because of a single event, but because of erosion, like metal scraping against metal for years until it wears down into dust. When it ended, Biff did not rage, and he did not complain. He understood this was a price not every artist is willing to calculate when they first step into the game of lights. And yet life rarely shuts every door at once. At a point when it seemed he had only music left to cling to, love entered his life again. Not loudly, but with certainty, like things that are born at exactly their right moment. This time he was no longer the Yorkshire boy, singing on the blazing breath of youth. He was a man who had walked through ruin, understood fragility, knew he could lose anything in a blink. His second marriage, therefore, carried a different shape, less noise, fewer vows, but deeper, steadier, like metal that has been through enough fire that it no longer fears being bent. In a small house in Yorkshire, where wind runs along the fields where he nearly died at 17, Biff found again what the stage could never give him. Not applause, but the ordinary breath of being human. Family was not a place he ran to escape. It was where he returned. And when the children arrived, his world changed color. Full, but quiet. Loud, yet warm. There were mornings when he sat fixing a guitar string and heard the children running down the hall, and suddenly knew he was living inside a part of life his childhood never would have allowed him to imagine. But even in that happiness, music still pulled him away. Long tours made him miss more than he wanted. Midnight calls home, the children's voices through the phone, the long silences after a greeting. Everything felt like evidence of a life split into two regions that he could never balance perfectly. His son, Seb, grew up among drum kits, demos, days of a father away from home, and nights hearing his voice on the radio. Perhaps that is the only way a child can understand and forgive an artist. To see their work as something that forms them, not something that steals them. Seb took up drums not because Biff pushed him, but because in that house, music was never silent. When it spoke, the boy understood that his father was not only someone who had to leave, he was someone who had lived most of his life inside sound. The day Seb stepped onto a stage as a drummer, Biff stood in the wings and heard his son's beat rise like his own heartbeat, stronger, younger, but made of the same material. It was not a moment of simple pride. It was a moment when a life was continued through sound, an invisible line from frozen Yorkshire to the present. Even though he was private, Biff did not hide one truth. Family was the only thing that kept him standing through the years of illness. When his heart slipped out of rhythm, when cancer returned like a familiar darkness, when 2025 forced him to postpone shows and cancel festivals. It was not metal shouting, not the lights, but the people sitting beside his bed that stopped him from falling. One night he woke after a dizzy spell and looked over to see his wife asleep in a chair, her hand still holding his. He thought of everything he had lost, everything he had endured, everything he had once believed would end. And he knew, if there was a reason for him to live longer, to step on stage again, that reason was right there beside him. No cheering, no demands, only holding his hand to remind him that life still had a part for him beyond the songs. Biff once said, "Music helped me survive. Family helps me keep living." That sentence is like a small door opening onto a part of life stage lights can never reach. When someone who has lived through a childhood of fractures, an accident that cut across the future, years standing at the edge of life and death because of illness, can still say that in a calm voice, then what remains after everything is not the glow, but the reason he continues. For decades, people only saw Biff through the roar of Saxon, sound hard as metal and straight as the Yorkshire wind. But the deepest part lies in how he kept himself from drifting away from his roots. A boy who once sat alone in a weaving shed, singing softly to drown out the silence of days without his mother, years later stood before 70,000 people and still sang with that same essence. Not polished, not decorated, only the truth of a human life. That consistency makes his music belong not only to the era of NWOBHM, it belongs to anyone who believes that pain, if it does not kill us, can become a tone. Saxon were never a band that chased chart positions. They passed through the explosive 1980s, then fell into the dark zone of the 1990s when the market shifted, then stood up again through a more primitive instinct, to play music as a way of existing. Along that road, Biff was the axis that kept the wheel from leaving the ground. When the label wanted them to be more American, softer, easier to sell, he was the only one who asked back. So where will the part that comes from machine oil, coal dust, and the northern wind go? At every age, he held to the same answer: nowhere. It will stay inside every line he sings. That persistence became a quiet influence. Many younger bands came to him not to ask for technical advice, but to understand how an artist can go through half a century without losing the voice inside. And Biff's answer was always so simple it almost sounded backward in the industry. Know where you come from, and don't sign anything that makes you forget it. Others spend a lifetime to realize that. But he understood it the moment his leg broke at 17. That there are some things, if you trade them away, you will never get back. Another current in his silhouette lies in the songs that carry the breath of history. As age lowered and thickened his voice, Biff did not cling to the high notes of youth. He used that very weight to tell stories. From songs about kings and warriors, to stories of soldiers' fates and the fragility of ordinary people before the storms of an era, he turned metal into a place to remember the past, not through books, but through drum beats and riffs. People came to Saxon seeking strength, but stayed to hear a man speaking about his own roots. His impact became clearest at the moment he seemed weakest. The years of heart treatment, then cancer, then returning to the stage with shorter breath but sharper eyes. One young rocker once said that seeing Biff walk out after surgery was the reason he kept making music after a season of despair. Not because Biff was immortal, but because he did not hide his limits. He did not wear a superhero's cloak. He walked on stage as a real human being, and that is what made his presence stronger than any roar. The most beautiful continuation came from the simplest thing: a father standing in the wings watching his child play drums. Seb does not play exactly like his father, but in his rhythm, there is a tone only those who grow up among guitar strings, amplifiers, and goodbyes before showtime can understand. It is the moment music stops being a career and becomes a current continuing in another body. An artist cannot choose how the world will remember him, but he can watch part of his life continue without any promise needing to be spoken. And at the end of the road, when he stands in a small Yorkshire garden, listening to wind slip through rose bushes like a memory returning from far away, people understand that what remains is not the giant stages or the titles the world gave him. What remains is a rare wholeness between the man living off stage and the man seen in public. A life without shields, without decoration, so honest it can sometimes unsettle others. He carried music for a long distance, but he carried that nature longer still. Bluntness, endurance, and the ability to remain himself through endless change. Perhaps that is why, when one day his voice finally closes, what will echo in memory will not be volume or technique, but the feeling of a man who lived true to himself from beginning to end and reminded us that sometimes the greatest legacy of a life is the honesty it never loses. If Biff's story makes you rethink the journeys each of us has to walk through, leave a comment below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so we can meet again in other stories about people who have lived, fallen, stood back up, and left something behind for this world.